Well, we'll accept pretty good.
Thank you. And I'm doing a sleep study tonight
Hmm.
to get
Well,
fitted for a CPAP.
I hope you get plenty of sleep.
I do too. I do too. So ho hopefully I'll be able to get one of those really small CPAPs
Hmm.
instead of a full face mask.
Darth Vader one.
Yeah, I don't want that.
Mm. Sylvia,
But we'll see.
do you have sleep apnea?
Yeah,
Oh, bless
I
your
had
heart.
a,
Bless your heart.
I had a sleep, thank you. I had a sleep study about a month ago, and it showed that I have sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea. So now I have to go back for what they call titration, where they'll fit me with a CPAP machine.
Mm.
So
Hey, everyone, I've got a rather urgent prayer request. I just got off the phone with Gabe Velez, and Elena has been on the phone with her sister in the Philippines. It appears that Elena's oldest brother, his name is Felipe, fell, passed out, was unresponsive. The details are very unclear at this time. They are very distraught about this at this time because they don't know for sure whether Felipe is actually passed away at this point in time or what's going on. But would you go to God in prayer with me at this time on their behalf?
Yeah.
God, our Father, we just bring this urgent need to you at this time. Father, we know that Gabe and Elena are very distressed about what's going on with her brother Felipe, and we just pray that you would be of comfort and strength to Gabe and Elena at this time, as well as Felipe's family. And we just entrust this situation to you, Father. But we just pray that the outcome is in accordance with your will. We pray for comfort and strength for this family at this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Michael.
Maybe we'll have more details later, but that's what we know at this time.
All right, can everyone see the screen?
We can.
Okay, the Maccabean Revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty. All right, so let's move on. This is, we are studying this, well, the last 5 weeks of the quarter, the intertestamental period, or between the testaments. Last week, we looked at the temples, including even the tabernacle, Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and then Herod's temple. So today will be the Maccabean Revolt, and that's going to be our first introduction to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then next week we'll get in more into depth with the Jewish sects, and then week after that will be the synagogue. And then we will be doing Rome and the Herods. So today's the Maccabean Revolt. And our sources, primary first Maccabees. Kevin asked me what my text was going to be. Well, since we're studying between the Testaments, our text is coming from a source that was between the Testament, first Maccabees. And that's the primary source material. It's part of the Old Testament Apocrypha, meaning hidden, or sometimes it's called a deuterocanonical second canon. It's not recognized as part of the Jewish canon, which was adopted at the Council of Jamnia about 70 AD or so. One of the primary reasons was it was written in Greek, and they only accepted writings that were originally in Hebrew. It's not quoted in any of the New Testament writings. It's included in the Catholic, but not the Protestant canon, where it's called the deuterocanonical books, and they're generally placed between Malachi and Matthew. It's written about 104 BC, so about 100 years or so before the birth of Jesus, after the death of one of the Maccabeans, John Hyrcanus. Written in Greek, which would have been why it couldn't have been part of the Hebrew canon, and later translated into Latin. But some scholars think it may have been originally written in Hebrew because there are Hebrew idioms or Hebrew figures of speech contained within the book. The author is unknown, but he's believed to be a very devout Jew who was strongly opposed to the Greek influence on the Hebrew way of life, Greek or Hellenism. God is not specifically mentioned in the book here in First Maccabees, not mentioned as God or the Lord Yahweh, but First Maccabees 2:61, he is referred to as him, and in First Maccabees 4:55, he is referred to as heaven, and we'll be looking at both of those passages in the study this morning. Now, Josephus is another source, but he essentially quotes Maccabees word for word in antiquity, so he's not an original source. He uses First Maccabees, so there's really only one source. The setting of the Jews were under Syrian reign or Seleucid rule. Seleucid was one of Alexander's generals who inherited a territory after Alexander died. The ruler we're going to be looking at primarily is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His name means God manifest. He ruled Israel, Palestine area, Parthia, which is today Iran, and Syria. And his capital was Antioch, the same Antioch where the disciples were called Christians. He was a strong Hellenist and wanted all of his empire to embrace Hellenism. And here's the area right here. Here's Jerusalem, the Jews' land. Syria is this area up in here. And of course, Parthia is what we have today as Iran. So he ruled all this area. Here's sort of our timeline here. We have Malachi is what we were studying. He's within the Persian time period. And then we move on to Alexander. He conquered a large territory going as far as India, Egypt, places like that. But he died relatively young at the age of 32. And then the area came under the Ptolemies, who was one of his generals, and then later under the Seleucid control. In the area, this is the timeline we'll be looking at in the lesson today. Here's Alexander, here's the four generals. Ptolemy, Jews first came under Ptolemy, and then later on under Seleucus. So as our background, we'll be looking at First Maccabees, New Revised Standard Version, which reads very similar. In fact, both the ESV and NRSV are based upon the Revised Standard Version. So we're starting about time of Alexander. Alexander the Great, the son of Philip the Macedon, came from the land of Kitab, had defeated the King Darius of the Persians and the Medes. This is the empire that the Jews were under at the time of Malachi. Alexander he succeeded him as king. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth, pretty much covering a lot of what the Roman Empire covered, even going as far east as India. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries and nations and princes, and they became tributary to him. But he fell sick at a very young age, and scholars even today are not quite sure what caused his death. So he knew he was dying, and so as he was dying, he got together four of his top generals who had been brought up with him from youth. So even his generals were about the same age as he was, so about in their early 30s, and he divided the kingdom up among them while he was still alive. That saved since he didn't have any heirs, that saved them fighting over the kingdom. After he reigned for 12 years, he died. And then those 4 officers began to rule. They all put crowns on, and so did their descendants after them. And the writer says they caused many evils upon the earth with their, their Hellenism, and they're wanting to bring all the empire under Hellenism. From them came forth a sinful root. That's who we're going to be talking about, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He was the son of Antiochus the Great, and Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage in Rome. Rome had defeated Antiochus the Great, and to make sure that he remained loyal, he had to send members of his family to Rome as a hostage, and Epiphanes was one of those. So he was a hostage in Rome. And he began to reign there about 175 BC, the kingdom of the Greeks, and there his image on a coin. In those days, certain renegades, these were Israelites, and they misled many, and they wanted to join with the Hellenists, the Gentiles. They said, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. That seems strange because he wanted them to do that anyway. So since it pleased the Jews, in response to that, they decided they would build a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom and remove the marks of circumcision. This was popular among the young boys and young men. Imagine you've had a life where basically you do 2 things. You work, and then one day you rest, and that rest has so many rules. You can't do so many things. Now you've got work, you've got rest, you've got recreation and entertainment. This was very popular among the young people. And in the gymnasium, you worked out naked. So they didn't want to be different than the other Gentiles in there. So they removed the marks of circumcision. That's called epispasm. It comes from the Greek word here. And apparently it was a very popular procedure among young Jews of the 1st century to remove those marks of circumcision. Even Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians. Of course, Corinth was a Greek city there. And he's talking here about, remaining in the state that you were before you became a Christian. You don't have circumcision, uncircumcision, you don't have to change it. He says, let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. If you're circumcised, remain that way. He's talking about being a Christian, not to do it to join the gym and not stand out at the gym. The gymnasium, it was the center of communal life, business, and learning. We'll see in a couple of weeks that it fulfilled the same role as the synagogue later would in that area. The one area it was different primarily, it was a place for exercising the body and bathing and participating in sports. The gymnasium there that was built, it was built by a high priest by the name of Jason, and he got his position actually by purchasing the position from Antiochus IV. So he didn't rightfully gain it, but he used bribery to get it. So here's a gymnasium that's in Sardis. This is a little bit removed from our time frame, but it's quite a large building. This was from about early 4th century. But if you look at here's the floor plan of the synagogue and, of the gymnasium. And look what we have in the gymnasium. There's a synagogue within the gymnasium in Sardis. So Antiochus not only conquered this area, but then he went and conquered Egypt, which was given to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. So he went after his territory. And then after doing that, he went against Israel and came to Jerusalem. And then he needed some money, so he raided the temple, which was typically what leaders did when they wanted money, because there's all that gold there. And then highlighted in red is all the things he took out of the temple. And then he returned to his home. And in doing so, he shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. This was about 168 BC. 2 years later, then, the same king, sent to the cities of Judah a tax collector, and he comes to Jerusalem with a large force. He's he wasn't happy with raiding the temple. Now he wants to collect taxes. On every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood. They defiled the sanctuary. And because of them, remember this, because of them, the residents of Jerusalem fled. And that includes the Maccabees that we're going to be studying about this morning. Jerusalem became a dwelling place of strangers. She became strange to her offspring. Her children forsook her, and weeds grew up all around the city. Then the king wrote to the whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. Same thing pretty much happened with Daniel during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, where they wanted to give them up their Jewish practices. All the Gentiles accepted. Well, of course, they wouldn't have any problems. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and they profaned the Sabbath day. They didn't keep the Sabbath. So the king, he sent letters by his messenger to Jerusalem and all the towns of Judah. And now they're given official orders, no longer doing it, Jews no longer doing it voluntarily, but now they're directed to follow the customs of Hellenism. They were to forbid the burnt offerings and sacrifices of Judaism, the drink offerings. They weren't allowed to keep the Sabbaths and the Jewish festivals. They defiled their sanctuary. They built off foreign altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols. There was a sacrifice of swine and other unclean animals in Jerusalem. And they were required now to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. And for whoever does not obey the command shall die. So you really get the idea that the writer here, he was a devout Jew, and he was strongly opposed to all the requirements imposed upon them by Antiochus Epiphanes. This reminds you a bit of the time of Daniel. Whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. Remember in Daniel, the golden image, when the whole trumpets blow, you were supposed to bow down and worship the golden image. And if you didn't do so, you would die. If you offered a petition or a prayer to anyone other than the king, you'd be thrown in the lion's den. And Daniel did that. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were put into the fiery furnace. But why swine? Why sacrifice swine upon the altar? Turns out a sacrifice of pigs, specifically sows, was a sacrifice within the Greek worship system. It was a sacrifice to the Greek goddess Demeter. She was the goddess of fertility of the harvest. The equivalent of the Roman goddess was Ceres, from where we get the word cereal. She was the goddess of grain. And in the month of Kislev, we'll be reading a lot about the month of Kislev. It's equivalent to our November, December. There was a sacrifice to Demeter of sows. The reason for December, it was because it was halfway between the end of the previous growing season and the beginning of the planting for the next growing season. So that's why it was done in December. And the reason that they sacrificed sows is because they were the most fruitful of all the livestock. You know, cattle will have one calf, sheep or goats, they will have one young, but sows have litters of 8 to 10, so they were the most fertile farm animals. So that's why they wanted to sacrifice a sow, because they wanted a bountiful grain harvest the following year. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in 145th year of the Greek Empire, that corresponds to December 7th, 167 BC, they put up another altar dedicated to Zeus over the Lord's altar. So they built an altar on top of the altar, in addition to building other altars throughout the towns of Judah. So there's the footnote on that right here. An altar built over the temple sacrificial altar, and this one was dedicated to Zeus. So 10 days later, on the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on this altar that was on top of the Lord's altar. And according to the decree issued by the king, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, as well as their families. And they also killed those that were performing the circumcision. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. I'm not sure, did they also kill the infants? No mention specifically of the father, but it says their families were killed. So the entire family wiped out if you performed circumcision. But many in Israel, they still resisted, they stood firm, and they were resolved in their hearts not to eat the unclean food. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they made an offer, just let us eat vegetables, and if at the end of certain time, then we'll eat your food. But it turns out eating vegetables, they had a better appearance than those eating the rich food that the king wanted them to eat. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the Holy Covenant, and many of them did die, dying rather than violating their beliefs. But finally, the straw that broke the camel's back, finally someone has had enough, and that was Mattathias. He was the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Joarib. Before David died, he appointed 24 divisions of priesthood that would serve. Each would serve for about a week, and then the next one would serve. So there's 24. So they would serve 2 weeks of the year, that's 48. And then the remaining 4 weeks would be for times of feasts and festivals. And then during those times, all the priests would come in and serve in Jerusalem. Now he had 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas called Maccabeus, or called the Hammer, Eleazar, and Jonathan. Matthias, he's zealous, and he saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem. In fact, he moved away from Jerusalem. Remember the passage where many of the pious Jews left Jerusalem due to all the things that were happening there. And he said, alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens. So in response, as a sign of mourning, Mattathias and his sons, they tore their clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and they mourned greatly over what was happening in Jerusalem. So they get away, but unfortunately, the problem follows them. The king's officers are now going out from Jerusalem, and they were enforcing the apostasy in other areas. The word is the Greek apostasia, and it's only found twice in the New Testament. You know, we hear a lot about the apostasy that's happening, but it's only mentioned in Acts 21:21, where it's translated as forsake Moses, and then 2 Thessalonians 2:3, where Paul says that the rebellion or the apostasy must come first. So now the king's officers were coming to the town, Modin, where Mattathias had moved. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. So the king's officers were trying to get Mattathias as a leading citizen to comply. So the officers spoke to Mattathias and says, "You are a leader, honored and great in this town and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done." Well, remember, all the pious people, all the people that want to obey the Lord's commands have left Jerusalem. So it's not surprising that those left in Jerusalem wouldn't have any problems. So if you do this, if you come forward, then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. So this king's officer was very shrewd. First thing he does is he compliments Mattathias and gives him praise, said, "Your man is greatly honored." He gives him honor. He says, "If you do this, you'll be among the friends of the king. And if you do that, you'll get perks, you'll have access to the king and you'll be greatly honored." And then silver, gold, and many gifts. So there's compliments, there's honor, and then there's bribery. He's really wanting him to set the example for everyone else in town to comply with the commands. So here's Jerusalem here, Mount of Olives. And then here's where Mattathias and his sons have moved 17 miles away from Jerusalem. But they still can't get away from the king's officers. So Mattathias answers in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commands, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right or to the left." Does this remind you of anything that someone else in the Bible said? "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." A little bit, this reminded me of Joshua. "Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river." So choose you who you're going to serve, the king's ordinances, Antiochus Epiphanes, or you're going to serve the Lord. "I'm going to serve the Lord," is what Mattathias said. When he finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar according to the king's commands. I don't know if he was just trying to come forward, trying to do this so Mattathias wouldn't do it. But when Mattathias saw this, he burned with zeal. Zeal will be a repeated word throughout the remainder of what we're going to be reading. The zeal for the Lord. And his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed the man on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. And we're going to learn that Mattathias was actually a descendant of Phinehas. And Phinehas was a grandson of Aaron. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his 5 sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. So first of all, they had to flee Jerusalem. They moved to Modin, and now they're having to flee to the hills. So why did this take so long? why did they put up with this so long? This is from the new intro from the New Oxford Annotated Bible. Before the time of the Maccabees, Jews had usually cooperated peacefully with their foreign rulers, or they were supposed to. For since the time of Jeremiah, they had believed that such rulers were part of God's plan to chastise and redeem Israel. Not all Jews supported the Maccabees in their armed revolt against the Seleucid government. Many tried to adapt without abandoning the Torah. Others preferred just to die. The author of First Maccabees believed that the Hasmonean rebellion, Hasmoneans were the descendants of Mattathias. They believed that the rebellion and the subsequent rule was in accord with God's divine will. And here's our passage from Jeremiah, Kevin, that I mentioned. And when your people say, why has the Lord our God done all these things to us? You shall say to them, as you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your land, so shall you serve strangers in a land that is not your own. This doesn't apply perfectly because they were not wanting to serve foreign gods, but we see here that people sometimes are put in positions by the Lord, as discipline for not obeying the Lord. Paul will say something in Romans 13 regarding existing powers. Of course, they didn't have Romans back at that time. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And keep in mind, when Paul is writing this, the governing authority was Nero. So one thing they had to do here was do a little bit of change with regard to the Sabbath. They are at war, and if you refuse to do anything on the Sabbath and the enemy knows it, then you're going to be in deep trouble. Those seeking righteousness, as we read, fled to the wilderness. The king's forces went after them. There was a group there in the wilderness, and the king forces were right there next to them, and they ordered them to return and go back to their town. But it was on the Sabbath, and they refused to do so, so they agreed to die rather than to return or even to fight. And 1,000 people died because this happened on the Sabbath day. There was mourning for their loss, and they decided that they would not initiate any fighting on the Sabbath, but if they were attacked, they could at least defend themselves on the Sabbath. So here's that passage. They made a decision that day, the day of the mourning, that they would fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our kindred died in their hiding places. So anyone attacking you on the Sabbath, you could defend yourself against attack, but they would not initiate any actions on the Sabbath day. So finally, we lose Mattathias. Now the days drew near for Mattathias to die, and he realized he was going to die. Arrogance and scorn have now become strong. It is time of ruin and furious anger. Now, my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for covenant of our ancestors, for the law of Moses. Give your lives for the covenant. And then he gives them a talk, words of encouragement, words to live by. Remember the deeds of the ancestors, which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name. Now, see if the following passage reminds you of anything in the New Testament. Was not Abraham found faithful when tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment. Remember when Potiphar's wife was trying to have Joseph sleep with her, but he kept the commandment. And as a result, he became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our ancestor, because he was deeply zealous, he was the one that killed the Israelite who brought a foreign woman into a camp. He was zealous and received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua fulfilled the commands. Next, we have Caleb. He testified in the assembly. Remember, he and Joshua testified that they could take the land, whereas the other 10 spies, they were afraid. David, because he was merciful, inherited the throne. Elijah, great zeal for the law. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They believed in the Lord. They were saved from the flame. Daniel, because of his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of lions. And so observed from generation to generation that none of those who put their trust in him will lack strength. Did that remind you of anything in the New Testament? Maybe Hebrews? Anyone out there? Hebrews 11?
Yep. God's hall of faith.
Yep. Anyone who put their trust in who? In him.
In him.
Some of the versions, the Good News translation, put their trust in the Lord. Right there. There's Mattathias. Look at all his sons. They look like, they all look the same, don't they?
Cookie cutter.
Yep. Mattathias, he was a descendant of Asamoneus or the Hasmoneans, so that's why they are called the Hasmoneans. And 3 of his sons, Simon, Judas, and Jonathan, would follow him as leaders during the revolt. So I won't look at this, but this shows where all the battles were. Here's Modin right here, and they fled into the wilderness. We have forces, Syrian forces coming down from Antioch, coming from Syria, and there were 3 major battles during this period. The revolt only lasted about 3 years. It didn't last that long. And then this shows Judas Maccabeus when they actually surrounded Jerusalem. The cleansing and dedication of the temple, 164 BC. Judas and his brothers said, move past or see our enemies are crushed. There's sanctuary, so they take over and they take over Jerusalem. Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering. That's the one where they placed another altar upon it, and they sacrificed the swine. So they tore it down, and they put the stones away until a prophet of the Lord should come and tell them what to do. So they were waiting for a prophet. So they took the unhewn stones of the law and they built a new altar out of the former one. And then they finished all the work. So they cleansed the temple, they cleansed the area, and then they just 164 BC. This is the Feast of Dedication. They decided so they rededicated on the very day, the very season that it had been profaned. 3 years later, they put a new one up. All the people fell on their faces and worshiped and blessed heaven who had prospered them. Heaven who had personification of heaven here. Some of the versions have, they blessed the Lord who had prospered them, or they blessed the God of heaven who had prospered them. Here it is in the Good News. They praised the Lord for giving them victory. This is all the stuff that they did. They decorated the temple and they observed the days of the dedication of the altar. And they said it should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. And even Jesus mentioned in John 10, 22 and 23, was at the temple during the Feast of Dedication in winter in the month of Kislev. So let's look at the Hasmonean rulers. We've got about 7 minutes. So here's all the rulers, beginning with Judas, Maccabeus, Jonathan, Simon. These three were the sons of Mattathias. And then we had one woman ruler, Salome, Alexander. Judas Maccabeus, he died shortly afterward. His son Judas was then selected to lead the military effort. Fortunately, during this time, the Seleucid Empire, that's the empire of Antiochus Epiphanes, they had other problems in other areas. So those problems actually helped the Maccabeans because Antiochus couldn't focus his time and energy on them. So they took Jerusalem, rededicated the temple. Later on, 163, the ban on Jewish worship was removed. That satisfied some of the Jews, but others wanted to go beyond that. They wanted religious freedom, and they also wanted political independence. Judas is killed on the battlefield by the Syrians. Jonathan, his brother, then takes over. He also exploits the problems with the Seleucids. He became high priest as well as leader. Problem was he was not a Zadokite. He was not of the high priestly line. So here we have the beginning of people becoming high priests that really didn't fit the correct genealogy to become the high priest. And we heard earlier that Jason actually bought the high priesthood. Then Simon, only surviving son, he was helped by the fact that the Seleucid king needed his help because there were other claimants to the throne. So 5-minute warning. Jews then were freed of their payment of tribute, so that was helpful. Yoke of the Gentiles was removed. All the Seleucids agreed to leave Jerusalem, and then Simon and his followers enter in triumph. He was given both political and religious leadership, the high priesthood. Now, having both positions was something that the Hasidim, the pious ones, or the Pharisees, did not believe that one person should have both the political leadership, the military leadership, and the religious leadership. He made treaties with Rome and Sparta. So that was an issue of contention between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Is that like separation of church and state?
Yes, yes. They wanted the high priest not to be also the civil leader. John Hyrcanus, he was the son of Simon. He escaped Ptolemy's attempt to kill him also. Policy of conquest, he added areas. Here's something that got him into trouble later on. He forced Idumea to accept circumcision, to come under the leadership of the Jews. And then Idumea, this is where Herod would come in.
Yep.
The oppressed became the oppressors. So first they were not allowed, the Jews were not allowed to do circumcision. Now he's conquering other areas and making them do circumcision. And Idumea, remember, came from Esau. Esau was circumcised, so apparently once he was no longer a son of the covenant, they gave it up. He destroyed the Samaritan temple and the city of Samaria. And then he changed his allegiance from the Pharisees to the Sadducees. The Pharisees did not want, one person have both of the high priesthood and the civil leadership. The Sadducees didn't mind, and the Sadducees were in favor of Hellenism. Israel's territory increased to similar during the time of Solomon. He allowed Hellenists to join the Jewish community. The ideals of the Greeks, the Hellenists, were perpetuated in the party of the Sadducees, and the Orthodox Jews opposed it, and that was in the party of the Pharisees. They gained independence in 129 BC, and that independence was confirmed by the Roman Synod. The Hasmoneans then took over the high priesthood, and the office became increasingly worldly because of their reliance, their alignment with the Sadducees. And this might have been the time when the Essenes, they thought that the leadership at the temple was corrupt, and so they went out and lived in the desert. Aristobulus came next. He was, oh, this is interesting, the eldest son of John Hyrcanus. He preferred, his Jewish name was Judah, but he preferred to go by his Greek name. He imprisoned his 3 brothers. He openly claimed the title of king and also a Philhellene, a lover of things Greek. He aligned with the Sadducees. Alexander Janus, after the death of Aristobulus, then his widow released those 3 brothers, and then she married one of them, Alexander Janus. Again, he became both high priest and king, which did not make the Pharisees happy. Worshippers at the temple pelted him with fruit. He performed the drink offering incorrectly. He was supposed to pour the drink offering on the altar, but he poured it out at his feet. And that made the Pharisees mad, and they sort of pelted him with lemons. Relations with the Pharisees deteriorated, and then here's our first mention of crucifixion. He crucified 800 Pharisees, and while they were on the cross, he had their wives and children killed in front of them. His life was characterized by debauchery. Countries divided at his death. His widow then, she was the widow of the 2 previous leaders. She becomes queen or the leader. Pharisees, she was aligned with the Pharisees. Being a woman, she could not become high priest, so her son became the high priest. Her other son became the military leader. This was a peaceful reign. At her death, her son Aristobulus gained control. The other son, he was allowed to peacefully retire to his estate. Remember, they took Idumea into the kingdom there, and the governor of Idumea was Antipater, and he worked behind the scenes through Hyrcanus, the one that was allowed to retire, to have him come and try to gain control. With Antipater's help, he defeats Aristobulus. To the north, the Roman general Pompey is now defeating Syria. That's where the Seleucids are headquartered. Both sides seek help from Rome. Aristobulus, he bribes him. He has the most money. He receives the help. Then Pompey later becomes suspicious of Aristobulus, and then he comes and then takes over Jerusalem. This is 63 BC, and then Roman rule begins in 63 BC. So the Romans come in, and it's ironic that they were actually invited to come in to settle a dispute between the 2 Jewish parties. So this is the beginning of Roman rule then in 63 BC. So next week we'll look at more detail of the Jewish sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. So thank you for listening, and you have a safe trip, those of you who are headed to the building, and have a safe week.
Thank you, Warner. That was
You're
great.
welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Warner.
Thank you,
You're
Warner.
welcome.
Uh,
I'm gonna.
Thank you, Warner.
Did the powers that be kind of look at the book of Maccabees as a political hot potato?
I'm not sure about. I don't know. It was-
I just wondered how widely it had been read or circulated, or were only a few copies available.
Yeah. Well, I know some of the books of the pseudepigrapher were read around, because I know Peter and Jude refer to like the Assumption of Moses and the books of Enoch, but they were around. I know they were Latin. They were there at the Dead Sea.
Well, it was very interesting. Thank you.
But they had been preserved. Without First and Second Maccabees, we wouldn't be having Between the Testaments.
Absolutely.
Because remember, they said they didn't even know what to do with the stones. They were waiting for a prophet of the Lord to tell them what to do with these stones. You know, can we use them?
Yeah. Yeah. They were probably looking for a spiritual way of disinfecting them.
Yeah. They didn't have Clorox wipes. Speaking of which, we found Clorox wipes at Walmart yesterday. No limit.